Have you noticed that in almost every major speech or public address, President Putin repeats the same familiar mantra? He pauses, looks at the audience and says, "The war will not end until its root causes are eliminated." Oh, it sounds as if there is some grand, profound meaning hidden behind this phrase. But after that, it's always the same foggy vagueness. NATO at the borders, the Polovtsi, the Ruriks, mythical threats, combat mosquitoes, biolabs. The list is never ending, and so on, but the root cause has never once been named. And here a natural question arises: why does a man with the nuclear button, someone who is not at all shy about killing left and right, feel so deeply embarrassed, so uncomfortable, to explain what exactly he's doing it all for? What kind of reason is this? One that cannot be spoken aloud even when you possess absolute power. What is he really trying to hide behind these endless, ever-present historical backdrops? To understand this, you need to look more broadly. Not just at recent years, but at decades past. Imagine two neighbors who throughout their entire lives have always been told that they are the same, just like brothers, and that they share the very same roots. But in reality, each of them has their own unique past, their own distinct character, and their own individual way of life. One, with all the mistakes, chaos, and scandals, is gradually learning to live differently, to choose their leaders, to argue, to change, to breathe freely. While the other, for many decades, has gradually grown used to living within a strictly vertical power structure, to always having a boss or superior above them, and to the deeply ingrained idea that taking initiative is dangerous and that independence is almost considered a crime. And what truly irritates him is not the cherry orchard near the picturesque snow-white cottage, nor the alluring European dreams. What really infuriates him is the very fact that the one who was always portrayed to him as the younger sibling, the one he was told to see as subordinate, has suddenly stopped obeying. That this neighbor now lives without seeking permission, makes their own choices independently, and does not submit to someone else's will or authority. That they have their own distinct and independent political agency, and it does not necessarily align with the interests, goals, or desires of the elder generation. It doesn't feel like a clear political break, but rather a deeply personal betrayal of the myth, the story, and the narrative he grew up with and believed in. That's why peace plans, red lines, and endless scare stories about Western threats are just a shell, a superficial layer, a convenient language for something much simpler, much more basic, and much more unpleasant, uncomfortable, and difficult to accept. Something that perhaps cannot be voiced publicly, so as not to destroy one's own legend. And that is precisely and exactly why he keeps circling around the issue, going in circles, but never actually names or identifies the real underlying root cause. Or maybe, just perhaps, it is simply... And now comes the most interesting and intriguing part, because if you take a moment to rewind the tape, it becomes absolutely clear and evident. All of this did not start in the year 2022, not in the year 2014, and not even in the year 2004. The war was not a response to the Maidan events, to the elections, to NATO being at the borders, or to a change of power or leadership in the country. On the contrary, there were simply too many. At first glance, it was clear that strange and rather unpleasant steps were already happening long before all these events. There were just too many preparatory moves, too many unexpected coincidences, and too many decisions that suddenly lined up perfectly. This does not look like chaos at all. In fact, it seems to be quite the opposite of chaos. This is a script, and in this script there is a starting point. And here's the main point: all of these lines, political, legal, military, and ideological, ultimately converge together in one single place. At a specific moment when a decision was made in Moscow that explains everything that happened afterward. From the destabilization of Crimea back in the 1990s to the full-scale invasion. Almost no one remembers this moment. Yet it was precisely this moment that became the real starting point of what has now become a full-scale war. And what you were told for so many years was simply just a reaction to unfolding events was actually part of a much longer-running and ongoing process. Can you guess, perhaps, when the timer was originally set? Keep watching. You're about to find out everything. It's well known that Crimea had been destabilized for a long time. Many remember Yuri Meshkov, who, while serving as president of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, wanted to introduce the ruble zone and campaigned for the peninsula to join the Russian Federation. In the year 1995, Leonid Kuchma completely stripped Meshkov of all power and authority by abolishing the position. Meshkov left for Russia, where he continued his anti-Ukrainian activities. And in 2011 he returned to the peninsula supposedly for his wife's funeral, but at the same time made a number of scandalous political statements accusing Ukraine of stealing gas. By the way, it was then that he used the word Novorossiya, and he called for organizing resistance against the Ukrainian authorities in Crimea. The example of Meshkov, Zatulin and other Russian politicians who came to the peninsula for propaganda purposes clearly shows that even after the rise to power of the controlled and loyal to the Kremlin Yanukovych in 2010, they continued their activities both on the peninsula and in other regions of Ukraine. Subversive activities. Moreover, it was clearly and unmistakably sanctioned by the Kremlin, since their official rhetoric was very similar to each other, as if the speeches were written from the same playbook. The seizure of Crimea could have happened much earlier, but due to the wars in Chechnya, Georgia, and for a number of other reasons, it had to be postponed. Let's at least recall the events around Tuzla in 2003, when Russia tried to seize the Ukrainian island and the surrounding territory, but at that time, it was avoided. Ukrainian troops were put on full combat alert, and Leonid Kuchma, who was frequently criticized for his consistently pro-Russian political stance, personally went to meet with President Putin and reminded him that he was, after all, the president of Ukraine, not the Ukrainian SSR. According to Ihor Voronchenko, who in 2003 was the commander of the regiment of the separate 32nd Army Corps stationed in Kerch, the reaction of the Ukrainian authorities at that time was swift and decisive, unlike in 2014. He believes that this was a move by Russia to destabilize the situation in Crimea and to see how prepared Ukraine was to defend itself. On the other side, the 7th Airborne Division was being prepared. Tactical exercises were conducted on our side as well, by the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and our regiment included a rocket artillery battalion. And we demonstratively deployed the battalion to its positions, Voronchenko recalls. After the events of 2003, the Russian leadership calmed down for a while, or rather pretended that it no longer laid claim to Ukrainian territories. Nevertheless, Putin and his associates continued to prepare for war. Many people remember that the attack on Ukraine was preceded by a series of information, legal and economic wars that were actively waged by the Kremlin in the years leading up to the conflict. This was clearly visible on Russian television. On one hand, independent media were being destroyed and opposition journalists in Russia were persecuted or sometimes simply eliminated. On the other hand, the policy toward Ukraine was becoming increasingly unfriendly. By 2013, anti-Ukrainian and anti-Western rhetoric had transformed into military propaganda. The Russian population was already being prepared for armed conflict. Russia's legal preparations for war were carried out at the highest legislative level. Various regulatory acts were adopted to most effectively establish control over Ukraine. If you trace the chronology of these documents, it becomes clear how this process unfolded. You can see how Moscow's demands became stricter, how questions were raised about the legal status of Crimea, the level of Ukraine's cooperation with NATO, and the status of the Russian language in Ukraine. And of course, we can't forget the significant economic blows dealt to Ukraine by the Russian leadership. How Kyiv was pressured through trade and tariff wars, how gas supplies were cut off, and Ukrainian goods were systematically blocked in Russia with completely trivial and often fabricated pretexts invented for these actions. It is noteworthy that it was primarily the eastern and southern regions of Ukraine that suffered from the economic war, as they were the most dependent on the Russian Federation, both as recipients of resources from Russia and as a sales market. Putin did everything possible to make the residents of these regions blame the Ukrainian central government for everything, even though in reality it was he who was responsible for their economic troubles, as well as the local leadership, represented either by direct Kremlin agents or by collaborators loyal to the Russian Federation. In the summer of 2013, Russia increased its economic pressure on Ukraine, virtually shutting down Ukrainian exports at the border. At the same time, Putin was also pressuring Yanukovych, forcing him to suspend the signing of the agreement with Brussels. Well, the cowardly actions of the professor and his obedience to Putin, as we know, led to the protests on the Euromaidan. What happened in Crimea in February and March of the year 2014 is considered to be the final phase, specifically the active phase of an operation that, in fact, had actually been ongoing ever since the very moment Ukraine gained its independence, according to Vice Admiral Serhiy Haiduk, who served as the commander of the Ukrainian Navy from March 7, 2014 to the year 2016. Vadim Skibitsky, a representative of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, points out that the presence of the Russian military group on the territory of Crimea as well as the Black Sea Fleet, which had been strengthened in the years leading up to the war, posed a serious military threat to Ukraine. At any given moment, this particular group could have potentially launched large-scale coordinated operations. If we compare the available intelligence indicators, they became clearly and unmistakably evident precisely in the year 2013, when, after the Kharkiv agreements of April 21, 2010, it was already absolutely necessary. Russia began covertly bringing modernized equipment into the territory of Crimea to strengthen its military groupings. And in 2011-12, the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine has recorded that Russian paramilitary groups are training in Crimea, including the 810th Marine Brigade. The Russian Federation is working on the training of illegal military formations in Crimea. Major General Viktor Nazarov of the Ukrainian Armed Forces says that back in the year 2012, the Ukrainian General Staff officially reported this military threat from Russia, but then Defense Minister Pavel Lebedev did not wish to hear about it at that time. He replied, "How can you plan a war with our strategic partner, our neighbor? Are you all crazy? I won't even show this to the president." From the spring and summer of 2013, new troops and equipment were being transferred to the Ukrainian peninsula, contrary to all agreements on limiting the military contingent. At the same time, information about these movements was kept secret by the Russian side. At the same time, Russian armed forces groups were being reinforced in the border regions with Ukraine, such as Rostov, Voronezh, and others. Military equipment, including heavy weaponry that would later be used to shell Ukrainian territory in 2014, was gradually being moved closer to the border in these regions. For example, the rocket attack near Zelenopilya in the Luhansk region. It is also worth noting the joint Russian-Belarusian military exercises Zapad 2013, which were held from September 20th to 26th, 2013. They took place at training grounds in Russia and Belarus. More than 10,000 military personnel and 180 pieces of military equipment were involved. The scenario of the exercises stated that a certain friendly country appeals to Russia and Belarus for help in restoring order in the country and assisting in eliminating terrorist groups that have seized power. It later became clear that Ukraine was meant, although this was never officially announced. Even then, the Kremlin understood that many Ukrainians were dissatisfied with Yanukovych and that his regime, which was leading the country into a dead end, could fall at any moment. That is why, in the event of the legitimate leader being overthrown, preparations were already underway to seize Ukrainian territory. When we began to analyze and saw the deployment of the first and second echelons of reserves, the configuration of troops that was practiced during those exercises, it was exactly this scenario that was repeated in 2014. Against us, already with the occupation of Donbass, says Vadim Skibitsky, a representative of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. It is also important that after the Zapad 2013 exercises, some Russian troops did not return to their permanent bases, but remained near Ukraine's borders and were used in 2014 during the occupation of its territory. Let us also separately note the Sochi Olympics. Under the pretext of preventing terrorist attacks, during these sporting events, the 31st Separate Air Assault Brigade from Ulyanovsk, as well as the 98th Airborne Division from Ivanovo, were transferred to the Krasnodar region. Later, their soldiers, under the guise of "they are not there," vacationers and volunteers, took an active part in the attack on Ukraine. But in 2013, they were simply pretending to be fighters against terrorists and were waiting for orders for a completely different war. Operation. Dear viewers, please support our channel on Patreon. The link is in the cards, on the screen, and in the video description. Pay attention to the black, blue, and red flags of the DPR, which appeared in Donetsk in the spring of 2014, in the hands of opponents of the Euromaidan movement. This parody tricolor was created back in 2004 to 2005 as the flag of the public organization Donetsk Republic. One of its founders, Andrei Pergin, who later became the chairman of the People's Council of the DPR, had been organizing pro-Russian rallies, strikes and pickets at the SBU building in Donbass since the time of the First Maidan. Pergin and his associates said that the creation of the Donetsk Republic was sort of a response to the First Maidan, and the appearance of the black, blue, red tricolors was already as the flags of the DPR, a response to Euromaidan. But all these arguments are negated by just one fact: the distribution of passports of the citizen of the Donetsk Republic during the period of 2011 to 2012, when Yanukovych held the presidential seat and his party of regions had monopolized power. Residents of Luhansk remember how in 2012 at the Cosmos Shopping and Entertainment Center, which belonged to another Putin supporter, Vladislav Krivobokov, strange events were held, accompanied by the distribution of such passports, as well as leaflets and literature. On the covers from that time, you can clearly see the same tricolor with the double-headed eagle. Those handing all this out kept repeating, "Ours will be coming here soon." In response to what did Comrade Pergin and the Russians supporting him organize such events and prepare the population of Ukraine's eastern regions for separation from the country? And why did neither the leadership of Luhansk nor law enforcement agencies who knew about this improvised passport distribution take any action at the time? The answer is simple. They themselves were in regular contact with Russian politicians and intelligence services, helping to prepare the ground for the occupation of their region. All of Pergin's claims that the Donetsk Republic was created and developed solely by the residents of Donbass do not correspond to reality. If at the initial stages of this movement's development the Russian side was almost invisible, then as it drew closer to the bloody events, by 2014 the involvement of the Kremlin and Lubyanka in supporting Pergin's actions became increasingly obvious. Another piece of evidence of Russia's plans to occupy Ukraine is the subversive activity in the Luhansk region of the Don Cossacks. It was later revealed that the masquerade with sabers and whips was just a cover, and in reality these people underwent real military training with modern weapons in the Rostov and Voronezh regions in 2011 and 2013. And subsequently, they fought as part of the People's Militia of the quasi-states of the LNR and DNR. There were several Cossack organizations that flooded Donbass and had their command centers in Russia. For example, the Great Don Army. Ataman Nikolai Kazitsyn, although considered a resident of Donbass, had close ties with the Russian Federation and was subordinate to the Russian Viktor Vodolatsky, who became a deputy of the Russian State Duma in 2012. The Great Cossacks regularly held pro-Russian events in the Luhansk region, and if in the 1990s they still somehow tried to conceal their anti-Ukrainian stance, after Putin came to power, with each passing year they behaved more and more openly and aggressively. Ukrainian activists repeatedly drew the attention of law enforcement agencies to the fact that Russian Cossacks, when holding their gatherings in the territories of Luhansk and Donetsk regions, openly referred to them as Don host oblasts belonging to the Russian Federation, completely ignoring Ukrainian law. But the response from the Security Service of Ukraine and the prosecutor's office was rather sluggish. And in January 2014, again still under Yanukovych, at the initiative of the Luhansk Regional Council, these Cossacks were already given weapons called voluntary patrol units and allowed to guard certain administrative buildings and patrol the streets. Naturally, when Yanukovych fled the country and the Euromaidan supporters eventually came to power in Kiev, these Cossacks, along with loyal police officers, quickly and decisively took control of most of the Luhansk region. And other sites, such as the security service buildings, military units and so on, were seized by force. And let's not forget that long before Yanukovych fled Kiev, Luhansk Oblast was simply being flooded with weapons, which were distributed both to previously recruited residents of Donbass and directly to Russian citizens sent to eastern Ukraine. Let's also recall such a prominent activist of the Russian Spring as the Esau of the faithful Cossacks of the Black Sea named after Suvorov, Andrei Shibichenko. Who was specifically overseeing this? Whether it was the Black Sea Cossacks, the GRU, the FSB, or other Russian security forces is still to be determined. But what's important is that his example clearly shows how the agent network operated during the period from 2011 to 2013. There were dark spots in Shibichenko's biography as a medical professional, including a criminal case for professional negligence that resulted in a patient's death. Russian special services operating in Ukraine primarily tracked people like this, those who had compromising material against them and were easier to control. In 2012, Shibichenko, who had previously lived in Odessa, moved to Luhansk and became the editor of the website Russian Luhansk. Don Cossacks, together with priests and parishioners of the Moscow Patriarchate, block roads in Luhansk and demand either the installation of a monument to Catherine II or criticize various draft laws being submitted to the Verkhovna Rada for consideration. After that, Shibichenko writes reports about the events held on Russian Luhansk. Moreover, from the pages of this resource, he and his associates regularly sling mud at well-known Luhansk scholars, journalists and politicians. They threaten them with physical violence and call for their expulsion from Luhansk. Moreover, Kazak was so confident in Russia's support that back in April 2013, without any hesitation, he declared, "I will fight against the SBU, the prosecutor's office and all of Ukraine. We'll meet at the barricades when they rise up in Luhansk." He said this 6 months before the first protests on the Euromaidan even began. Shibichenko did not seem like a city madman, and as later events showed, he wasn't just trying to scare people with talk of war and barricades, he actually knew about them for real. And of course, he was aware of the increased activity of Russian troops in Crimea and the border regions of Russia. By the way, you can Google the barricades and checkpoints in Luhansk that were built in the spring of 2014 by LNR members and the Russians overseeing them. They were constructed professionally and in no way resembled the makeshift handiwork of ordinary Donbas miners. Shibichenko himself, whom the devout elderly women affectionately called Father Andrei, served in one of the churches in Luhansk. At the same time, he traveled to the Rostov region, where he underwent military training, clearly not with Cossack sabers. In the spring of 2014, this priest, along with other Russian Spring activists, took part in the seizure of buildings, and by summer he appeared on YouTube as the commander of a mortar crew in the Zarya battalion. By the way, it was this very unit, this illegal armed formation, was accused of shelling Luhansk not only by the Ukrainian side, but also by the first head of the LPR, Bolotov. Shibichenko was eliminated in the winter of 2015 near Chernukino during an attack on the positions of the Ukrainian armed forces. And in April 2021, the grateful LPR authorities, who had used him as cannon fodder, unveiled a memorial plaque for him in Luhansk. Undoubtedly, one of the most important tools in Moscow's hands was the clergy of the so-called Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which was essentially a branch of the Russian Orthodox Church, subordinate to the Moscow Patriarch Kirill Gundyayev. Taking advantage of the trust of devout parishioners, these merchants in cassocks regularly conducted anti-Ukrainian propaganda in their churches. Long before the Euromaidan, Sunday schools and parent committees were established at the churches, whose main purpose was not so much to promote faith in God, but rather to engage in political activities, distribute leaflets, sow distrust of Ukraine among parishioners, and frighten them with tales of a decaying West and the prospect of joining NATO. Together with the Don Cossacks we mentioned earlier, as well as Vitrenko supporters and communists, what a surprise, priests and parishioners of the Moscow Patriarchate held religious processions and advocated for union with Russia. And they opposed any attempts by the central government, let's recall Yanukovych was still in power then, to take even the slightest step toward the West. By the way, at such events you could also spot the well-known Luhansk deputy provocateur Arsen Klinchev. He was a member of the Party of Regions and was backed by the regional leadership. In October 2013, he became head of the Luhansk branch of Medvedchuk's organization, Ukrainian Choice. And as for who was behind Medvedchuk, we have all known that for a long time. His godfather is the Bunker Führer. In March 2014, Klinchev and his associates seized the regional administration building and raised the Russian flag. They were later detained and taken to Kiev, but after some time, for reasons unknown, they were released. And so this kind of surrogate, made up of pro-Russian organizations, Cossacks, Orthodox groups, communists, Vitrenko supporters, Medvedchuk supporters, and so on, under the beautiful name of a religious procession, would appear in Luhansk. And with each passing year, right up until the war itself, they blocked traffic on the streets more and more often. The fact that the participants in these orgies were ideologically incompatible didn't bother anyone. What united them all was their hatred of Ukraine and, of course, their service to the Putin regime. The fact that the Luhansk diocese of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate was acting on orders from Russian handlers is indicated by the overwhelming majority of priests supporting the Russian Spring. And some of them, like Volodymyr Moretsky, even took up arms and went to fight against Ukraine. There were priests who did not fight themselves but simply blessed Russian soldiers and LNR separatists, consecrated their barricades, trenches and military equipment. It is also worth mentioning other important priests such as Alexei Slyusarenko and Alexander Avdyuhin, who both before the war and during it regularly and on a consistent basis traveled to Russia, where they received the necessary instructions. And they conducted propaganda work on the internet. So the timer mechanism on this bomb was set precisely on August 24th, 1991. This was exactly the moment when Ukraine officially declared its independence. At that very instant, the safety catch clicked into place in Moscow. Just 2 days after the Declaration of Independence on August 26, 1991, Yeltsin's press secretary Pavel Vashchanov officially stated that Russia reserves the right to reconsider its borders in the future. This is a public fact. They didn't let the Ukrainians go back then. They simply loosened their grip because they themselves were weak, hungry, and frightened. All these years, while Ukrainians naively believed in the Budapest Memorandum and the idea of brotherly nations, they were sharpening the knife. What Ukrainians called peace was, for them, merely an operational pause. Putin is afraid to openly admit that this war is not actually a reaction to threats, but rather a prolonged and delayed revenge for 1991. Revenge, of course, against the Ukrainians. He is deeply afraid that the world will eventually realize that his approach to geopolitics is nothing but banal resentment, which is essentially the envy of the dead for the living, and a destructive desire to destroy Ukraine. Putin is genuinely afraid to name or even acknowledge the true root cause of the war, because it is not about territory and it is not even about the past. It is in fact about the future, a future in which Ukraine exists as an independent nation, and Russia cannot understand or define who it is without Ukraine. And that ultimately is their real and profound catastrophe.